IELTS 15. Test 1. Part 3. You will hear two psychology students discussing the effects of the order in which the children in a family are born. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Ed, how are you getting on with the reading for our presentation next week?
Well, OK, Ruth, but there's so much of it.
I know. I hadn't realised birth order was such a popular area of research.
But the stuff on birth order and personality is mostly unreliable. From what I've been reading, a lot of the claims about how your position in the family determines certain personality traits are just stereotypes, with no robust evidence to support them.
OK, but that's an interesting point. We could start by outlining what previous research has shown. There are studies going back over 100 years.
Yeah, so we could just run through some of the typical traits. Like the consensus seems to be that oldest children are generally less well-adjusted, because they never get over the arrival of a younger sibling.
Right, but on a positive note, some studies claim that they were thought to be good at nurturing. Certainly in the past, when people had large families, they would have been expected to look after the younger ones.
There isn't such a clear picture for middle children, but one trait that a lot of the studies mention is that they are easier to get on with than older or younger siblings.
Generally eager to please and helpful. Although that's certainly not accurate as far as my family goes. My middle brother was a nightmare, always causing fights and envious of whatever I had.
As I said, none of this seems to relate to my own experience. I'm the youngest in my family, and I don't recognise myself in any of the studies I've read about. I'm supposed to have been a sociable and confident child who made friends easily, but I was actually terribly shy.
Really? That's funny. There have been hundreds of studies on twins, but mostly about nurture versus nature.
There was one on personality which said that a twin is likely to be quite shy in social situations because they always have their twin around to depend on for support.
My cousins were like that when they were small. They were only interested in each other and found it hard to engage with other kids. They're fine now, though.
Only children have had a really bad press. A lot of studies have branded them as loners who think the world revolves around them because they've never had to fight for their parents' attention.
That does seem a bit harsh. One category I hadn't considered before was children with much older siblings. A couple of studies mentioned that these children grow up more quickly and are expected to do basic things for themselves, like getting dressed.
I can see how that might be true, although I expect they're sometimes the exact opposite, playing the baby role and clamouring for special treatment.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
What was the problem with most of these studies, do you think?
I think it was because, in a lot of cases, data was collected from only one sibling per family, who rated him or herself and his or her siblings at the same time.
Some of the old research into the relationship between birth order and academic achievement has been proved to be accurate, though. Performances in intelligence tests decline slightly from the eldest child to his or her younger siblings. This has been proved in lots of recent studies.
Yes, although what many of them didn't take into consideration was family size. The more siblings there are, the likelier the family is to have a low socio-economic status, which can also account for differences between siblings in academic performance.
The oldest boy might be given more opportunities than his younger sisters, for example.
Exactly.
But the main reason for the marginally higher academic performance of oldest children is quite surprising, I think. It's not only that they benefit intellectually from extra attention at a young age, which is what I would have expected. It's that they benefit from being teachers for their younger siblings by verbalising processes.
Right. And this gives them status and confidence, which again contributes in a small way to better performance. So, would you say sibling rivalry has been a useful thing for you?
I think so. My younger brother was incredibly annoying, and we fought a lot. But I think this has made me a stronger person. I know how to defend myself. We had some terrible arguments, and I would have died rather than apologise to him. But we had to put up with each other, and most of the time we coexisted amicably enough.
Yes, my situation was pretty similar. But I don't think having two older brothers made me any less selfish. I was never prepared to let my brothers use any of my stuff.
That's perfectly normal, whereas sometimes...
That is the end of part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to part 3. Test 2. Part 3. You will hear two students of English called Kathy and Graham planning a display on 19th century British life and literature for a university event. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
OK, Graham, so let's check we both know what we're supposed to be doing.
OK.
So, for the university's open day, we have to plan a display on British life and literature in the mid-19th century.
That's right. But we'll have some people to help us find the materials and set it up, remember? For the moment, we just need to plan it.
Good. So, have you gathered who's expected to come and see the display? Is it for the people studying English or students from other departments? I'm not clear about it.
Nor me. That was how it used to be, but it didn't attract many people, so this year it's going to be part of an open day to raise the university's profile. It'll be publicised in the city to encourage people to come and find out something of what goes on here. And it's included in the information that's sent to people who are considering applying to study here next year.
Presumably some current students and lecturers will come?
I would imagine so. But we've been told to concentrate on the other categories of people.
Right. We don't have to cover the whole range of 19th century literature, do we?
No, it's entirely up to us. I suggest just using Charles Dickens.
That's a good idea. Most people have heard of him and have probably read some of his novels or seen films based on them. So that's a good lead-in to life in his time.
Exactly. And his novels show the awful conditions that most people had to live in, don't they? He wanted to shock people into doing something about it.
Did he do any campaigning other than writing?
Yes, he campaigned for education and other social reforms and gave talks. but I'm inclined to ignore that and focus on the novels.
Yes, I agree.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
OK, so now shall we think about a topic linked to each novel?
Yes, I've printed out a list of Dickens's novels in the order they were published, in the hope you'd agree to focus on him.
You're lucky I did agree. Let's have a look. OK, the first was The Pickwick Papers, published in 1836. It was very successful when it came out, wasn't it? And was adapted for the theatre straight away.
There's an interesting point, though, that there's a character who keeps falling asleep, and that medical condition was named after the book, Pickwickian syndrome.
Oh, so why don't we use that as the topic and include some quotations from the novel?
Right. Next is Oliver Twist.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot in the novel about poverty, but maybe something less obvious.
Well, Oliver is taught how to steal, isn't he? We could use that to illustrate the fact that very few children went to school, particularly not poor children, so they learnt in other ways.
Good idea. What's next?
Maybe Nicholas Nickleby? Actually, he taught in a really cruel school, didn't he?
That's right. But there's also the company of touring actors that Nicholas joins. We could do something on theatres and other amusements of the time. We don't want only the bad things, do we?
OK.
What about Martin Chuzzlewit? He goes to the USA, doesn't he?
Yes. And Dickens himself had been there a year before and drew on his experience there in the novel.
I wonder, though, the main theme is selfishness, so we could do something on social justice? No, too general. Let's keep to your idea. I think it would work well.
He wrote Bleak House next. That's my favourite of his novels.
Yes, mine too.
Oh,
His satire of the legal system is pretty powerful.
that's true. But think about Esther, the heroine. As a child, she lives with someone she doesn't know is her aunt, who treats her very badly. Then she's very happy living with her guardian, and he puts her in charge of the household. And at the end, she gets married, and her guardian gives her and her husband a house, where, of course, they're very happy.
Yes, I like that.
What shall we take next? Little Dorrit? Old Mr. Dorrit has been in a debtor's prison for years.
So was Dickens's father, wasn't he?
That's right.
What about focusing on the part when Mr. Dorrit inherits a fortune and he starts pretending he's always been rich?
Good idea.
OK. So next we need to think about what materials we want to illustrate each issue. That's going to be quite hard.
That is the end of part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to part 3. Test 3. Part 3. You will hear two students, called Hazel and Tom, talking about Hazel's media studies assignment. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Tom, could I ask you for some advice, please?
Yes, of course. If you think I can help. What's it about?
It's my first media studies assignment, and I'm not sure how to go about it. You must have done it last year.
Is that the one comparing the coverage of a particular story in a range of newspapers?
That's right.
Oh, yes. I really enjoyed writing it.
So, what sort of things do I need to compare?
Well, there are several things. For example, there's the question of which page of the newspaper the item appears on.
You mean because there's a big difference between having it on the front page and the bottom of page 10, for instance?
Exactly. And that shows how important the editor thinks the story is. Then there's the size. How many column inches the story is given. How many columns it spreads over.
And I suppose that includes the headline.
It certainly does. It's all part of attracting the reader's attention.
What about graphics? Whether there's anything visual in addition to the text?
Yes, you need to consider those too, because they can have a big effect on the reader's understanding of the story. Sometimes a bigger effect than the text itself. Then you'll need to look at how the item is put together. What structure is it given? Bear in mind that not many people read beyond the first paragraph. So what has the journalist put at the beginning? And if, say, there are conflicting opinions about something, does one appear near the end where people probably won't read it?
And newspapers sometimes give wrong or misleading information, don't they? Either deliberately or by accident. Should I be looking at that too?
Yes, if you can. Compare what's in different versions. And as far as possible, try and work out what's true and what isn't. And that relates to a very important point. What's the writer's purpose? Or at least the most important one, if they have several. It may seem to be to inform the public, but often it's that they want to create fear or controversy, or to make somebody look ridiculous.
Gosh, I see what you mean. And I suppose the writer may make assumptions about the reader.
That's right. About their knowledge of the subject, their attitudes, and their level of education, which means writing so that the readers understand without feeling patronised. All of that will make a difference to how the story is presented.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
Does it matter what type of story I write about?
No. National or international politics, the arts, anything, as long as it's covered in 2 or 3 newspapers. Though, of course, it'll be easier and more fun if it's something you're interested in and know something about.
And on that basis, a national news item would be worth analysing. I'm quite keen on politics, so I'll try and find a suitable topic. What did you choose for your analysis, Tom?
I was interested in how newspapers expressed their opinions explicitly. So I wanted to compare editorials in different papers, but when I started looking, I couldn't find 2 on the same topic that I felt like analysing.
In that case, I won't even bother to look.
So in the end, I chose a human interest story, a terribly emotional story about a young girl who was very ill, and lots of other people, mostly strangers, raised money so she could go abroad for treatment. Actually, I was surprised. Some papers just wrote about how wonderful everyone was, but others considered the broader picture, like why treatment wasn't available here.
I usually find stories like that raise quite strong feelings in me. I'll avoid that. Perhaps I'll choose an arts topic, like different reviews of a film or something about funding for the arts. I'll think about that.
Yes, that might be interesting.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for your help, Tom. It's been really useful.
You're welcome. Good luck with the assignment, Hazel.
That is the end of part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to part 3. Test 4. Part 3. You will hear two students of social history called Annie and Jack discussing their presentation about refrigeration. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
OK, Jack. Before we plan our presentation about refrigeration, let's discuss what we've discovered so far.
Fine, Annie, though I have to admit I haven't done much research yet.
Nor me. But I found an interesting article about ice houses. I'd seen some 18th and 19th century ones here in the UK, so I knew they were often built in a shady area or underground, close to lakes that might freeze in the winter. Then blocks of ice could be cut and stored in the icehouse. But I didn't realise that insulating the blocks with straw or sawdust meant they didn't melt for months. The ancient Romans had refrigeration too.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Pits were dug in the ground and snow was imported from the mountains, even though they were at quite a distance. The snow was stored in the pits. Ice formed at the bottom of it. Both the ice and the snow were then sold. The ice cost more than the snow, and my guess is that only the wealthy members of society could afford it.
I wouldn't be surprised. I also came across an article about modern domestic fridges. Several different technologies are used, but they were too complex for me to understand.
You have to wonder what happens when people get rid of old ones.
You mean because the gases in them are harmful for the environment?
Exactly. At least there are now plenty of organisations that will recycle most of the components safely. But of course, some people just dump old fridges in the countryside.
It's hard to see how they can be stopped, unfortunately. In the UK, we get rid of 3 million a year altogether.
That sounds a lot, especially because fridges hardly ever break down.
That's right. In this country, we keep domestic fridges for 11 years on average, and a lot lasts for 20 or more. So if you divide the cost by the number of years you can use a fridge, they're not expensive, compared with some household appliances.
True. I suppose manufacturers encourage people to spend more by making them different colours and designs. I'm sure when my parents bought their first fridge, they had hardly any choice.
Yes, there's been quite a change.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Right, let's make a list of topics to cover in our presentation and decide who's going to do more research on them. Then later we can get together and plan the next step.
OK. How about starting with how useful refrigeration is and the range of goods that are refrigerated nowadays? Because, of course, it's not just food and drinks.
No, I suppose flowers and medicines are refrigerated too.
And computers. I could do that, unless you particularly want to.
No, that's fine by me. What about the effects of refrigeration on people's health? After all, some of the chemicals used in the 19th century were pretty harmful, but there have been lots of benefits too, like always having access to fresh food. Do you fancy dealing with that?
I'm not terribly keen, to be honest.
Nor me. My mind just goes blank when I read anything about chemicals.
Oh, all right then. I'll do you a favour. But you owe me, Jack. OK. What about the effects on food producers, like farmers in poorer countries being able to export their produce to developed countries? Something for you, maybe?
I don't mind. It should be quite interesting.
I think we should also look at how refrigeration has helped whole cities, like Las Vegas, which couldn't exist without refrigeration because it's in the middle of a desert.
Right. I had a quick look at an economics book in the library that's got a chapter about this sort of thing. I could give you the title if you want to do this section.
Not particularly, to be honest. I find economics books pretty heavy going as a rule.
OK, leave it to me then.
Thanks. Then there's transport and the difference that refrigerated trucks have made. I wouldn't mind having a go at that.
Don't forget trains too. I read something about milk and butter being transported in refrigerated railroad cars in the USA right back in the 1840s.
I hadn't thought of trains. Thanks.
Shall we have a separate section on domestic fridges? After all, they're something everyone's familiar with.
What about splitting it into two? You could investigate 19th and 20th century fridges, and I'll concentrate on what's available these days, and how manufacturers differentiate their products from those of their competitors.
OK, that'd suit me.
That is the end of part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to part 3. That is the end of the listening test.